All right, let's get into it. We're about to break down an event that honestly sounds like it was ripped straight from a political thriller. But the thing is, its consequences are incredibly real. We're talking about the capture of a sitting head of state by a foreign military.
So, picture this. It's the early hours of January 3rd, 2026. The president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, is suddenly taken into U.S. custody. Just like that. And this one single operation, it kicked off a political firestorm that, you could argue, is still burning today.
And for the people on the ground in Caracas, well, it was just a night of absolute terror. I mean, listen to this eyewitness account. The sky just turned into a war zone with U.S. aircraft roaring overhead. This wasn't some far-off political move on a chessboard. No, this was a violent, real, and terrifying event happening right in their city.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did it come to this? How did years and years of tension between the U.S. and Venezuela go from sanctions and political arguments to a full-blown military raid to literally snatch a president?
Okay, first up, let's dive into the operation itself. It was codenamed Absolute Resolve, and believe me, it was a meticulously planned and executed raid.
This whole thing unfolded with just chilling precision. First, bam, a massive wave of airstrikes. We're talking over 150 aircraft hitting military bases and communication centers, basically blinding the capital city. Then, they cut the power to the entire city. And under that cover of total darkness, in go the elite Delta Force soldiers and FBI agents. And they had one target, President Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores. And they got him, right at his compound.
But you know, an operation like this always has a human cost. And it was incredibly one-sided. On the U.S. side, just 2 soldiers were injured, and not even life-threatening injuries. But according to Venezuelan officials, at least 40 people were killed in the attack. And that includes both military personnel and civilians.
And then, just like that, within hours, Maduro wasn't even in Venezuela anymore. He was photographed blindfolded on a U.S. military vessel and then flown straight to New York. Why? To face an indictment in a U.S. federal court. This is where the whole crisis just pivots, you know? It goes from a military conflict to a totally unprecedented legal battle.
So how in the world did the U.S. even justify this? And this, folks, is where we get to the real heart of the controversy. Was this a legitimate law enforcement action, or was it an illegal act of aggression, an invasion?
Well, this one event created 2 totally opposite stories. The Trump administration, they framed it as a simple law enforcement function. They said, look, we're just arresting an indicted fugitive, and they claim the president has the authority to do that. But pretty much the rest of the world, including the United Nations, saw it very differently. They called it a clear violation of international law, a violation of the UN Charter, and a total disregard for the idea of head of state immunity. So what was the U.S. legal case actually built on? Well, it rests on these really serious charges. The indictment basically says Maduro was leading a narco-terrorist group called the Cartel of the Suns, and that he was conspiring to flood the U.S. with cocaine. The argument was, hey, this guy isn't acting like a president, he's acting like the head of a massive criminal enterprise.
And back home in the U.S., supporters of the operation pointed to Article 2 of the Constitution. They argue that the president has the authority to protect the country from threats. And, in this case, they were defining narco-terrorism as one of those imminent dangers that justifies military action even without getting approval from Congress first.
But wait a second, you might be thinking, how can a U.S. court even hear this case, considering how Maduro was brought there? Well, the answer lies in this really obscure but incredibly powerful legal principle called the Kerr-Frisbee Doctrine. It's wild. It basically says that it doesn't matter how you got to U.S. soil. Even if you were kidnapped in a way that violated international law, the court can still try you. So for Maduro, this means that even if his capture was an illegal invasion, the U.S. court says, yep, we can still go ahead with the trial.
Okay, so this whole thing didn't just happen out of the blue. It wasn't a snap decision. This raid was the explosive ending to years, and I mean years, of rising tension between Washington and Caracas.
And you can see how things escalated, step by step. It all started with legal pressure, way back in 2020, when the U.S. first indicted Maduro. Then, after a really disputed election in 2024, that pressure starts to get physical. By mid-2025, you see a U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean. Then they start striking alleged drug boats. Then by December, there's a full-on naval blockade, seizing Venezuelan oil tankers. And then, the final step, the raid on Caracas.
Now, besides the criminal charges, there was another motive that was, well, stated pretty openly.
Right after the raid, President Trump held a press conference and made it crystal clear that a key goal of this whole operation was to get control of Venezuela's massive oil wealth. And when we say massive oil wealth, we're not kidding. What's at stake here is just immense. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, not to mention huge natural gas deposits and all sorts of valuable minerals. Let's be honest, control over these resources has always been simmering under the surface in the long standoff between the US and Venezuela.
So, as you can imagine, the reaction from around the world was immediate, it was intense, and it was completely divided.
On one side, you had predictable condemnation. America's big rivals, Russia, China, Iran, they all called it an active imperialist aggression. But what was really interesting is that even key U.S. allies, like France, spoke out against it. They were really concerned about this massive violation of international law.
But then on the complete other side of the spectrum, you had people celebrating. Argentina's president praised the move. And all over the world, from Miami to Madrid, communities of Venezuelan exiles, people who had actually fled the Maduro regime, were literally celebrating in the streets, hoping this was a new start for their home country.
And then you had the United Nations, which kind of reflected this broader international worry. The Secretary General basically warned that this raid set a dangerous precedent. He was deeply concerned that the basic rules of international law had just been thrown out the window, which could open the door for other countries to do the same thing.
And hey, this division wasn't just happening on the world stage. It sparked a huge debate right inside the United States. You had prominent Democratic leaders calling the strike an illegal, unauthorized act of war, while a lot of Republicans were defending it, calling it decisive leadership.
So where does this all leave us? What are the long-term consequences? What new reality has this one action created for the world?
Well, geopolitical experts are basically forecasting a major shift. They're worried this operation might have normalized so-called decapitation strikes, attacks aimed specifically at taking out a country's leader. Suddenly, that's a more thinkable option. Some experts think it could even push China to move faster on Taiwan or drive Russia and Iran closer together. And it could definitely speed up the push to move global trade away from the U.S. dollar.
Which really leaves us with one final and pretty critical question. The capture of Nicolás Maduro was, without a doubt, a historic event. But was it just a one-off, an exception to the rules, or was it the beginning of a whole new, much more volatile chapter in world history, one where military might, not international law, decides the fate of nations and their leaders? It's something to think about.